So today I want to talk about the idea of equity in health through the lens of gender and the lens of sexuality. So I want to start by unpacking the idea of feminism and feminist care ethics. Now, some people may say that feminists are radical activists that hate all men and only lobby for women's rights. But I would argue that this is just a stereotype, a sensationalized idea of feminism that is very much out of sync with the ideals of modern feminism. In reality, feminism aims to achieve equity and justice for all people, regardless of social, economic, or political standing. Feminism also emphasizes a person's right to self-determination, autonomy, and respect. The aim is to break down the traditional boundaries which had resulted in the oppression of both sexes. But you may ask, why is feminism relevant to health? The answer is that feminism is hugely relevant to health as its ideologies and practices so closely align with the goals of health promotion. Both of these things aim to reduce the systematic inequities that exist between groups. Equity leads to equality, and in this ideal, I say that yes, I am a feminist. However, despite affirmative action to reduce inequities, women, along with many marginalized populations, are still systematically excluded from powerful and influential positions in society. From teachers to financial analysts, women are paid less than men in female-dominated, gender-balanced, and male-dominated occupations. On average, women in the United States earn 77 cents for every dollar a man makes. In fact, female college graduates statistically earn less than males with only an 8th grade education. Gender, as it functions today, is a grave injustice. Now, this is a quote from Nigerian author and noted feminist Chimamanda Adichie, and in a previous video I talked about one of her TED Talks, and so I thought I'd incorporate another one of her viewpoints into this lecture, this talk that I'm having today. But as I said before, feminism isn't just about women's rights. It's a social movement striving for equity for all people. So with that in mind, I'm going to start looking at some of the literature surrounding women's health and then shift my focus and look at how healthcare is experienced by someone who identifies as LGBT. Anyway, here we go. Over the past 2 decades, we've managed to make a lot of progress in terms of women's health, specifically healthcare research. But you may be shocked to know that it wasn't until 1993, with the implementation of the National Institutes for Health Revitalization Act, that it was mandated that women and minorities be included in clinical trials. Up to this point, a lot of the data that we were using to treat women and minorities was data that we had collected from studies only focusing on white males. So this was a major step forward then. With women now being routinely included in clinical studies, we've learned a lot about the major differences in how men and women experience disease. But we still have a long way to go. In a TED Talks entitled His and Hers Healthcare, Paula Johnson explains that women's health is an equal rights issue as important as equal pay, and it's an issue of the quality and the integrity of science and medicine. Johnson goes on to further explain that there are some shortcomings right now in the practice of women's healthcare. As it stands, depression is the #1 cause of disability in women the world over. In fact, women are 70% more likely to experience depression over their lifetime compared to men. Further, heart disease is the #1 killer of women in the United States. And a recent study indicated that the way in which plaque forms in the arteries of women is much different than that of men, which makes detection, diagnosis, and treatment that much harder. Now, if we shift our focus for a second, I want to talk about gender-based violence at the individual level and how this affects a woman's experience of healthcare. In class, we had the opportunity to watch the trailer for the documentary entitled Saving Face. Saving Face chronicles the lives of Zakia and Roxana, 2 women who had been victimized by brutal acid attacks in Pakistan. With little or no access to reconstructive surgery, survivors of these attacks are left physically and emotionally scarred. Many of the reported assailants, often the husband, lover, or someone else close to the victim, received minimal, if no, punishment from the state. I found this video to be heartbreaking. It turned my stomach and it made me very angry and very anxious. What is occurring to these women is immensely unjust, and I found myself struggling very hard with trying to process the fact that something so horrific can be happening so frequently in our world. I was even more upset when I read the article by Kim and Motzi entitled women enjoy punishment. I found that this article raised many questions for me, and I found it very hard to relate with the medical professionals in this article. I can't imagine being in a position where my cultural beliefs would trump my medical practice in such a way that I ostracize and stigmatize individuals who have suffered so much. It was just a very hard concept for me to accept. So some of the questions that were running through my head while I was reading this article were, in theory, cultural humility should factor into how we practice as a healthcare provider. But what assumptions and baggage do we bring with us, and how does this affect our actual practice? How far do we take our beliefs and values and transpose them into our practice? Where's our professionalism? Where's our duty to serve the patients and uphold health? Where do we draw the line between cultural competence, a person's right to independence, and a need to uphold what we believe is basic human rights? Okay, so now that we've had a chance to look at health through the gendered lens, let's look at health through the lens of sexuality. What inspired me to talk about this was the article that Professor Donnell brought into class about the anti-homosexuality law in Uganda. Some background if you don't know, to date homosexuality is prohibited by law in Uganda. But the new law goes a step further and is now criminalizing positive talk of homosexuality and failing to report gay people to the authorities. This includes medical professionals. So from an intersectional perspective, we understand that the stigmatization that these people are facing is created and experienced at the intersection of two or more axes of oppression. These are things like sexual orientation, gender, race, and culture. And to be honest, I was taken aback when I found this out. I was totally unaware of what was happening in Uganda, and I think it's appalling. In fact, I'm a little bit embarrassed that I was so naive, and I just can't imagine how you can have so much hate for someone just because you don't understand them. We are truly lucky to live in a progressive country where people recognize, or at least are starting to recognize, the importance of accepting people for who they are. But again, we always have room to grow. McNair, in an article entitled Lesbian Health Inequalities, states that the health inequalities that exist for lesbian and bisexual women are due largely in part to the experiences of discrimination, homophobia, and heterosexism within the clinical setting. The issue of stigmatization can lead to avoidance of routine healthcare screenings and a reduction in disclosure of sexual orientation within a consultation, which has implications for both diagnoses and treatment and can actually be negative for a person's health. Further, research by Vicky and Cochran found that lesbians and gay men are at a higher risk for stress-sensitive psychiatric disorders than are heterosexual persons. This was largely attributed to perceived discrimination, with 42% of subjects noting that sexual orientation was the cause. The conclusion was that there was a positive association between perceived discrimination and harmful effects on both quality of life and indicators of psychiatric morbidity. So with that being said, I want to end today's video with a healthcare story that was told to me by one of my friends when we were discussing the topic of sexuality and health. I'm going to change the names, of course, but I believe that this story does a really good job of highlighting the biases that we may still bring to the table with us as healthcare professionals, whether we realize it or not, and how this may affect a patient's perceived healthcare experience. So a friend of mine, John, had been struggling with his sexuality for a very long time. But for the first time, in a long time, he had found someone who made him truly happy. John and his partner were together for a very long time, but things started to change. As time went on, no matter how much John loved his partner, he knew that the relationship was unhealthy and he needed to get out. But leaving the relationship wasn't easy. It came with a lot of baggage, heartache, and rumors. John is a pretty tough guy, but some of the stuff that people were saying really got to him, and it left him feeling worthless and down all the time. John felt like he was changing as a person. He wasn't smiling as much, he was irritable, and he couldn't look at himself in the mirror without feeling disgust. So one day he chose to take the first step and seek out help. After speaking to a nurse, John was directed to a room where he would be able to have the opportunity to speak with a counselor. John was optimistic that this experience would help him to work through some of the issues that he was experiencing. The counselor was a very sweet lady. She made him feel very comfortable, and he was ready to get started. John was actually surprised to see how well the counselor was able to read him and to understand his feelings. As the session neared to a close, however, the counselor began to get into asking John about what events had led him to these feelings that he was harboring. John expressed that he believed that it was because of his recent breakup. With that, the counselor began asking John about what had happened between him and his girlfriend. Now, John's partner was not a girl, it was a guy. And it was actually John's first relationship with a guy, so this was really important to him. But John didn't correct the counselor because he felt ashamed. This little slip-up started piling self-doubt back onto John about his sexuality, and he completely closed off. The progress he was making in that session was lost, as he made up a story to tell the counselor. He changed names and facts just to appease her and just to get the session over with. When he left the session, John didn't blame the counselor for assuming that he had a girlfriend, but he had made the decision right then and there not to go back. He felt that he could not truly be honest about who he was in that setting. So, what was John's perceived healthcare experience in that setting? Did John get the care he needed? Did he miss an opportunity to better his mental health? How do we prepare medical professionals to be more sexually neutral and to lead with open-ended questions, ones that allow patients to fill in their own unique context? I believe that by doing this, we would foster a sense of trust and understanding with our patients that leads to an open dialogue, one that allows us to make the most relevant diagnoses and suggested treatment for that patient in their context, in their life. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. I'll talk to you guys soon. Have a great night.